Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's episode in our series about the great political films is a film that you might or might not think is appropriate for the period between Christmas and New Year's Eve. It's Fight Club, directed by David Fincher. It's the choice of the writer and journalist Helen Lewis, and she and I are going to talk about what the hell we think it means. We recorded this conversation a little bit before Christmas, and as you'll hear, the film sparked a whole host of topics for us. So we are going to be talking about some things that are only tangentially related to Fight Club, but I'm also aware that maybe not everybody has seen this movie. If you haven't, very briefly, the story is of an alienated youngish man in a dead-end job played by Edward Norton. He's insomniac, he's depressed, who meets another alienated youngish man called Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt, a much more glamorous young man. And between them, in their alienation and anger, they decide to set up an underground fighting club called Fight Club. The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club, where other alienated men, frustrated men, can beat the crap out of each other, which is what we see them do at some length. It's bloody, it's really violent, it's bare knuckle, bones are broken. We discover at the end that, in fact, Edward Norton, Brad Pitt, these are two versions of the same human being. It's quite confusing, so don't worry if it sounds a bit confusing. The only other thing to say is that this is also a film which is about trying to take down global consumer capitalism. Fight Club morphs into something called Project Mayhem. In Fight Club, they beat the crap out of each other. In Project Mayhem, the same guys go around blowing stuff up in order to subvert the system. And that's kind of it. It is mysterious. It is baffling. We do try in this conversation to make some sense of it, but you'll need to listen to see if we actually succeed. So, Helen, did you see this film when it came out? It came out in 1999. I was trying to remember. I did see it in the cinema, so I'm guessing I saw it when it came out, but it's 25 years. It doesn't feel like 25 years ago that I saw it.
I honestly can't remember. I would have been a teenager when this came out, and my memory is that I either saw it at university or in my 20s. And I think in either case, I would have watched it with quite a lot of men, because I lived with, when the year I lived out at university, I lived with three guys. And then when I moved into London, I initially lived with three guys. So I think I would have seen it in quite a sort of laddish context at the time. And I was, I guess you'd say, a kind of ladette myself at the time.
And do you remember how it struck you? I mean, for instance, do you remember what you thought it was about? Because rewatching it now, it's about a lot of things, but it's about two things in particular. It's a movie about men and masculinity and fighting. And then it's a satire or a takedown of consumerist capitalism. And maybe it's other things too. But when you saw it back then with the lads, was it the fighting or was it the kind of anti-capitalism stuff that stood out?
I think it was the anti-capitalism stuff, because I was trying to think about it. The reason I chose this one is because I think it's part of a kind of really interesting moment at the end of the 90s in filmmaking. So you have American Psycho in the year 2000, which is Christian Bale. There's this really interesting version of masculinity in which he's simultaneously chopping women up and putting them in his fridge, but also wearing a face mask. So it's not unreconstructed misogyny. It's like this very much this new kind of, I care about my abs, but I'm also a psycho. And then there's The Matrix in 1999, which is the same themes. And I think actually the offices in Fight Club and The Matrix look the same. So Neo's got the same kind of cubicle job that is just completely meaningless. And he longs, like part of the reason that he decides to escape the Matrix is that he's just, there's nothing for him in the real world. All he does is live to go out to nightclubs. And I think another one that people often mention in this case is Office Space, which is a kind of deals with similar themes, which I haven't seen. But it does seem like there was a moment at the late 90s of this sort of sense of, we hate our boring 9-to-5 jobs. And I think you definitely get that in Fight Club. Although now, when I look about it, I think his job looks quite cool. So his job is that he's a claims adjuster, but he gets to go and see kind of crazily twisted car wrecks and decide whether or not to do product recalls. And he gets to fly across America. I mean, now that would all be done by AI, and at most he'd be having a Zoom, right? You just can, the film would not read the same now. Those jobs don't quite exist in the same way.
Yeah, and it's completely a pre-digital revolution film. 1999 is not completely pre the digital revolution, but in this film it comes across in that way. And the ways in which we are told that not just young men, but everybody is being oppressed by consumerist capitalism, the symbols of evil are IKEA and sitcoms. At one point, he kind of lists his charge sheet against the man, and it's IKEA and sitcoms. And it's quite quaint. I mean, the thought is that these men, there's a separate question, which we'll talk about the ways in which they've been oppressed by women, but the way they're being oppressed by corporations, it's that they're being sold tat, basically. It's not that they're being surveilled or having their minds messed with. It's not like now. It's that they are being almost required in ways they don't understand to buy nice home furnishings. It feels very last century.
I know, it's wonderful, isn't it? I threw this out on Blue Sky saying that I'd kind of watched it again and I was blown away by how differently I felt about it this time. And someone said, when I watched this the first time, I was like, yeah, down with the credit card companies. Now I'm like, oh, you want me to have a slightly dull 9-to-5 job that seems to pay pretty well and I can buy lots of IKEA furniture. No, please stop. You're hurting me. So I think that stuff, you're right. I was thinking about it being digital and you're right. Nobody has a smartphone. Nobody ever goes on the internet. It is all about old-fashioned kind of things actually happening in a community. Like everything happens in the physical space.
And I think he buys his IKEA furniture from a catalogue. My memory is there's a catalogue scene in this movie.
Yeah, there's a whole bit that's shot as if it's the flicking pages of a catalogue. And there's one bit when he's trying to get to sleep when he starts watching infomercials, which again makes me think of American Psycho, because one of the conceits both of the book of American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis and that then carried over into the film is a constant repetition of brand names in this very satirical way, that you have the Brooks Brothers suits and you have, you worry about whether or not you've got the Amex Platinum card or just the gold card. I think there was a book around that time, wasn't there, called Stuffocation, the idea that you're just kind of drowning in all this stuff that's being sold to you. And you would like to get back to this sort of primal life where you have experiences again rather than just things.
But it does seem to me that we're being given two versions of this kind of capitalism that's oppressing this guy. So some of it, it's mind-numbing, it's being asked to buy tat. And then there is the company he works for. So the job looks, it's interesting, and in a kind of J.G. Ballard way, going to the scenes of the car crashes has a kind of glamour to it. But there is a moment where he confronts his boss. His boss is a guy who oppresses him in the workplace, but is also a kind of nerd. But in a scene towards the end where he confronts his boss, he's basically trying to persuade his boss to pay him to do the job without requiring him to come into the office. He starts to blackmail him by saying, I know how this company works. And the way this company works is we allow families, parents and their children to burn alive in their cars because we have calculated it's not worth paying that small adjustment for the safety feature that would save them, which feels to me like a different kind of evil capitalism than IKEA. I mean, there are lots of things wrong with IKEA, but people aren't being burned alive. And that's closer to a sort of Unabomber sensibility or something. And actually, this film the Unabomber manifesto came out in 96. And I was thinking about it because of Luigi Mangione, the young man who's been charged with murdering the healthcare executive, Brian Thompson, and who has cited Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as one of his inspirations. And I don't know much about him. There's masses of speculation about this man online, but he feels a bit like he comes out of Fight Club. I may be misreading this, and I'm a bit nervous about speculating about this, but certainly there is a Unabomber manifesto vibe to Fight Club, which is not just soft furnishings are mind-numbing. It's capitalism. This kind of capitalism is a killer.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So Project Mayhem, which is their plan to do all this corporate destruction, which culminates with blowing up. They seem to believe if you blow up the buildings of credit card companies, that somehow brings down the world financial system. And my husband turned to me and went, even 99, they probably would have had a backup disc, wouldn't they? So I'm not actually sure what this has really done. But the one that I really got behind was the bit when they go and blow up the corporate sculpture. And I was like, yeah, and they roll it into a Starbucks, which again it's just totally, completely out. Like, again, whatever you think about Starbucks, on my list of evil companies, it's actually only a mid to low ranking one. It's not a kind of weapons manufacturer or a social media company. And that feels oddly kind of bloodless. But you're right. The one thing I do think about Luigi Mangione is a lot of the discourse around him revolved around the fact that he had kind of great abs. He was handsome and he had great abs. And I think there's exactly the same question hanging over Brad Pitt as Tyler Durden, which is the key question about the politics of Fight Club is, how does the film feel about Tyler Durden? The narrator by the end thinks that he's, ridiculous. He shoots himself in the face to get rid of this kind of shadow self and finishes by embarking on a relationship with a real actual woman rather than this psychotic male-on-male violence relationship. But there's an inherent problem when somebody is as attractive and glamorous as Brad Pitt, even though for some reason he's dressed as a sort of 70s pimp throughout. that he becomes a kind of anti-hero at that point. He becomes, because he's so charismatic and compelling, you can totally understand why people lionize him. That's purely about the aesthetic rather than the content.
One more thing on Luigi Mangione, because it's healthcare companies that he was taking on. He murdered the chief executive of a healthcare company. And part of me feels if this movie was being made now, that the corporate enemy would be, the people who are messing with the heads of these young men. And so it would have a kind of tech, cyber element to it. But actually, healthcare companies, it feels a bit more like what's going on here. Healthcare companies, credit card companies, and with healthcare companies, it's life and death. The implication is people. In the same way, actuarially, they're allowing families to burn alive in their cars in order to shave a little bit off the bottom line. This is the accusation against healthcare companies. And in 2024, 2025 America, it's something quite interesting and I'm really nervous about doing this because it's trivializing a murder. It was a real murder, not a Hollywood murder. But there's something a bit throwback about taking on the healthcare companies rather than, say, the tech companies or even the big banks. That was the thing that, to me, made this film feel a little bit more now, actually.
Oh, that's interesting. One of the things that made me feel it was a bit more now is that it reminded me there's a trend online for kind of things called looks maxing, or the idea of being a sigma. So that's the idea. You're not an alpha or a beta. You're not inside the wolf pack with the status. You're somebody who's on the outside and you've got your own identity. And that feels quite Fight Club. All of these guys see themselves as the kind of lone wolf outsiders. So I think it does have a huge amount of resonance now, as does the idea that, I know I've talked too much about gender, but the gender politics of art are obviously completely fascinating, because there's this famous line from Tyler Durden, we're a generation of men raised by women. And it's this idea about culture becoming feminized, which is something you hear all the time now. The American election, it was the kind of background drumbeat of it so much. And actually, the left-wing reading of Fight Club as a film that is actually oddly progressive is that Edward Norton's narrator moves through this life of sort of monastic excess, where he's just only interested in kind of status hierarchies of violence. And by the end of it, he's become a man. He's learned to control that, and he's embarking on a kind of hopefully meaningful relationship with someone else. In his case, a woman. And, that is the story really of it. But it's about whether or not you kind of fall for the glamour along the way. It's the way that Andrew Tate appeals to young teenage boys, because it's a kind of slightly sad idea of what a man is, right? That it's just about being big and strong. Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated how it sits with today's teenagers who, the ones who marinate in that soup of these kind of manosphere influencers.
So I did rewatch it with my 15-year-old son, and I don't want to put words into his mouth, not least because at the end of it, he didn't say much, except he looked completely baffled. I was surprised in a way. I thought he might be bored by it. I don't think he was bored by it, and it looks good, a lot of it, still.
It's a beautiful film. So David Fincher, I think, is an incredibly good director. He also did The Social Network, which is another portrait of a kind of alienated man getting his revenge on the world, and which Mark Zuckerberg of founding Facebook. So the film is stylish as hell and shot beautifully in the colours and the compositions, which again, I think talks about this kind of whether or not the aesthetic kind of overcomes the actual message of it.
I should say we're going to be doing The Social Network a little later on in this series. Yeah, he even makes, as you said, the office blocks look good. They're meant to be grey and boring, but they're not. They look amazing. But my son, I think he was genuinely baffled by it because it's a very odd film. And the ending in particular, we'll talk a bit later about what the ending means. And he'd heard that there was a twist. And he sort of said at one point, have we had the twist yet? The twist being that Tyler Durden is just the alter ego of the Edward Norton character. But it just doesn't follow, I think, the arc that you would expect in a film like that. The arc is quite strange. I did want to ask you about that line, we're a generation of men raised by women. He also says, Edward Norton says at that point, I'm a 30-year-old baby, he says. That's his other line. But what is the implication there? Because in the rhetoric of American life, sometimes that's about absentee fathers. So that's particularly a line that's sometimes raised in the politics of race, about absentee fathers. But I don't think that's what they're talking about here. I think they're more talking about the fact that they've been raised in a culture where child rearing itself has been feminized. But there is a question about the fathers. How do you read that line?
Yeah, we had in the Atlantic a really good piece, which about 25 years on by Stephen Kearse, which pointed out that every generation is raised by women. That's not it's not something that wasn't happening in the 1500s when everyone was living an authentic life. But I think exactly that. And I think you're right. In the context of America, when you hear about kind of single parent families, it's usually a kind of right wing knock on black families and what they see as kind of families falling apart, as a way of talking about crime, for example. So the fact that almost everybody involved in Fight Club was white does change the way that reads significantly. And also, I think the fact that everybody is white does make you think, oddly, there is no far right politics in what they're doing. Nobody's got a kind of Odin tattoo, some sort of Viking rune that kind of speaks about racial purity. It's oddly deracinated in that sense, I guess. But that might be just to go back to what things were like in the 90s, is that the default was much more assumed to be white. White people were just people. I think particularly in the way that Hollywood treated them, that was just every film, and men were just foregrounded in narratives in a way. If there weren't any women in the film, it almost wasn't really noteworthy at all. But I think that line sticks with people because it does speak to something that I think is a genuine undercurrent of politics then and now, which is the sense that female authority is inflicted on adult men in a way that it wasn't maybe pre-1950s. If you were an adult man in the Victorian times, when was there a time when, apart from the Queen, who really, kept out of politics to some extent and just did a lot of the waving, but when was a time when you were told off or told what to do by a woman? You weren't. You didn't have a female boss. Your wife was your property before, the 1840s. And a sense now, we ran a piece by Mike Pesca, who's a writer I really admire, and it picked up on something, which was it said the Democrats feel like America's HR department. And HR departments have become kind of definitionally female or feminized. And there is a huge amount of discourse online, particularly about the online right, about they have this concept called the longhouse, which is that they think that modern culture has become unacceptably feminized and is very snipey and passive aggressive. And they think that kind of DEI initiatives or the idea of microaggressions, this is how women settle arguments. They backbite and they snipe and they bitch. And actually the way that men, real men, settle arguments is they deck each other in the face in a car park. And that's why, again, I think Fight Club seems like a kind of modern film because you can definitely detect that undercurrent in American politics of, Elon Musk challenged Mark Zuckerberg to a MMA match, right? It was like, just when are you going to start stop smack talking me on the internet and let's get in a ring. And obviously it never happened because Mark Zuckerberg has got incredibly jacked and Elon Musk, just sits up very late doing tweets. And he used to take quite a lot of ketamine, I understand. He's admitted to that, so I'm not libeling him. But, I think he realized at some point he was actually just going to get pounded. He'd fractured a vertebrae in his back or something. This is in the Character Limit, the book about his takeover of Twitter. He got a sumo wrestler to his 42nd birthday party and decided to challenge him to a fight. And unsurprisingly, against a professional fighter, came off worse. But there is this kind of thing that, this feeling that modern men have become sort of soft-handed and they've got white-collar jobs. And I think in the same way that you see lots of tradwives content on the internet, which is a longing for women to go back to this kind of I want to be an earth mother and just have lots of babies and a farm and piglets. The version of that for men is I want to go back to a simpler time when we settled resolutions. We hunted elk and we settled disputes by fighting. And it's just an intensely nostalgic vision that actually in reality none of those people, but their revealed preferences that they do not want that, and yet they can't quite bring themselves to accept that they like having a desk job and buying IKEA furniture or whatever the modern equivalent is.
I think it's still buying IKEA furniture.
Yeah, still. I've got some IKEA furniture. I've got some Billy bookcases. I can't judge.
It is very interesting, though, in the film, the complaint is we've been raised by women. We are being told what to do by women. There is only really one female character in the film. That's Helena Bonham Carter. Most of the people who tell these young men what to do are men. So his boss is a man. And actually, there is a scene. I'm now thinking the fathers don't feature, but they do feature. Edward Norton and Brad Pitt have a little bitching session about their dads. And they complain about the fact that it's about going to college. Like, dad called me up, dad doesn't care about me, but dad called me up and told me to go to college. I think it's Brad Pitt who says this. And so I went to college and then I graduated from college and then I called dad and say, what do I do now? And dad said, get a job. It's like dad is the man and dad is telling me what to do. And almost the only female authority figure we see is early on in the film. So it begins, for people who haven't seen it, with Edward Norton as a tourist at groups for people who are suffering from terminal illnesses, basically. And we first meet him, he's suffering from insomnia. He goes to a doctor who's also a man. They could have had that part played by a woman, but it's a man who tells him he's not going to prescribe him sleeping pills. So he goes to the testicular cancer support group, and then he realizes the way he can get to sleep is by hearing about other people suffering. And in one of those groups, the group is led by a woman. And I think she's the only female authority figure that we see. And she's not an authority figure because she's actually leading a self-help group. Yeah, somewhere in the background is feminized HR and mothers telling their sons what to do, and potentially a politics in which women are going to be in charge. But this is an incredibly male world still.
Yeah, there's one very sweet scene between the narrator and Marla in which he comes around to check her breast for lumps, which is like the only moment you get between them where obviously he just spends all his time hating her because he sees her as the woman who comes around to have sex with Tyler Durden, who he doesn't realize is him. But yeah, there is actually one genuinely emotionally very sad in a film that is, quite tough about, trying not to, like, it's all about anime and not really feeling your emotions and therefore having to punch them out. That line right at the start from the guy who's in the testicular cancer group, who's obviously now infertile, saying, my wife has now just had kids with her new husband and I'm really happy for them. And not unexpectedly, he really burst into tears. And in that line, there is a whole kind of like, my life has been taken away from me. The idea of like fatherhood has been taken away from me. And actually, as a man, that's a really, I don't know what my role in the world is if it's not that. Like that's what I'd always thought that I would be. And I thought that really stood out as a genuinely brilliant piece of emotional writing in a film otherwise that kind of treats emotions with a kind of great deal of suspicion, I suppose.
Yeah, those groups are strange. We also have the woman who is dying and who gets up and makes her little speech in which she just says, will anyone here have sex with me? And the woman running the group ushers her off. And then we discover later on that she's dead. And Edward Norton at this point is in his I don't do emotions phase. And he kind of goes, well, what's that to me? I mean, there are some poignant, it's harrowing.
Yeah, and she just says, I just want to feel something, doesn't she? She says, I just want to feel something one time before I die. I mean, I love that stuff with the groups at the side. I think the reason this film didn't do very well when it came out, but it has kind of become a cult classic since. And I think one of it is it's got so many weird things in it that you remember. So you remember the detail of the soap that's made out of people's liposuction fat, because that's incredible. You remember the detail of the way that air, I still don't know if it's true. At some point in the last 25 years, I should have looked this up, about them pumping in the oxygen so that you feel high when the plane crashes, so that so you just take it on the chin and don't make a fuss. Or the ass or the crotch bit when he's getting out of the seat. Or the cancer support groups are another example. There's just all the splicing bits of frames into the films when the continuity, all of that stuff. It's a film that's actually incredibly rich. The reason I felt sort of slightly disappointed with it, I felt the central plot line did not grip me as much as it did. And I think probably what you remember is the vibe and the impression, and then these little pearls along the way that are just incredibly weird and memorable.
One other thing before we talk about the fighting, the other thing that this film is about, Meat Loaf. So that's the other thing that really does stand out.
It was Meat Loaf's big break. Meat Loaf and his gynecomastia. Yeah, which again is really, really sweet and sad.
And a very, very unusual piece of casting because, again, my son, he was completely, he knows who Meat Loaf is, right? And he was, what's Meat Loaf? Introduced, we were sort of joking when Meat Loaf's agent said to him, now, Meat, we've got some good news here. You've been cast in a big role in a Hollywood film starring Brad Pitt. The first thing we discover about you is you don't have any testicles, but you do have breasts. And then it's sort of downhill from there if you want this to be a dignified, and then your head gets blown off at the end. It's a really, really unusual piece of casting. It's almost messing with the audience. I mean, I like it. It's almost it's a slightly subversive thing to do in a movie like this.
I love it. And all of those Meat Loaf Jim Steinman songs are all big, like rock operas, right? The ones that he's famous for are like often 10 minutes long. They're these huge opera, like he had a very particular persona, which wasn't straightforwardly masculine. It was quite theatrical and, not, well, okay, I was going to use the word camp, which I think is the one thing that this film isn't, which I think is really interesting. Because if you often get films that are about stylized violence or hypermasculinity, they often end up just being profoundly camp. And there's a brilliant interview with, of all people, Sylvester Stallone talking about this, engaging with the Susan Sontag book about it. And I don't find this film camp at all. It's very po-faced, but it never actually tips over into being camp.
Yeah, and even, or maybe even especially Meat Loaf, that role is not camp, although he does play it in a very feminized way. And he has a sort of high-pitched or relatively high-pitched voice. And, the first time we see him, he wants Edward Norton just to hug his breasts, essentially.
Yeah, he is a guy who's been sort of drained of his masculinity, and which is a very literal way of kind of emasculation. He's been both literally and metaphorically emasculated. Whereas Jared Leto, in his terrible, I mean, some bad prosthetics happening there. I think that we can say that his weirdly done eye is not a high point of makeup design, and his bleached blonde. Like, one of the really most interesting side notes of it, in that he is the foot soldier. And I think it's really interesting that between Fight Club and Project Mayhem, the dictum goes from being don't talk about Fight Club to do anything that Tyler Durden tells you. The second one is do anything that Tyler Durden tells you. And the Jared Leto character, and to some extent Meat Loaf's character, are there to say that there is a kind of longing for authoritarianism inside a lot of people. Some people do really just want to be told what to do by some charismatic man. And that's an impulse that we should sort of recognise and deal with.
After I finished watching it, I thought, I don't know anything about Meat Loaf. I mean, I don't know what kind of a guy was he? Did he have politics? So I looked him up. And he was an interesting man. And he had an interesting political trajectory. He was a Democrat. And then he came out for Mitt Romney when Romney ran against Obama. And then he kind of came round to Trump. So by the end, he was Trump. And by the end, he was a COVID skeptic, COVID denier. And he died of COVID, which is quite probably a slightly tasteless thing to say, but quite a Fight Club sort of ending. To die of COVID as a COVID denier.
When you were saying that, I sort of instantly thought, I bet he went Trumpy. And I was trying to work out what it was about Meat Loaf that is Trump coded. You know, this sort of idea that everything is now right or left wing coded, like unpasteurized milk is now right wing, broccoli is left wing, that you can do this kind of, and I suppose in Britain, the taxonomy is more like sort of leave and remain, that you can, if I say something to you, I say recycling, you instantly know whether that's leave or remain. And I wonder if in Meat Loaf's case, it's just because of his weight, which is so associated. If you are white and overweight in America, you are probably now a rural Trump voter. You know, people in the cities are thinner and people in the cities are Democrats. But I agree with you. I do wonder what my reaction was to it when I would also have known Meat Loaf as being the guy who did Bat Out of Hell and Not a Dry Eye in the House and whatever other things I would do anything for love. He was also brilliantly, you probably won't have seen this because you're more highbrow than me, in the Spice Girls movie.
Oh, I know, because it was in my little reading up on him. I was going to say he does do camp. He was also in Rocky Horror, right?
Oh God, I forgot he was in Rocky Horror. He is in the Spice Girls movie, which I've seen both in its original form in the cinema, and also I went to a couple of years ago for a sing-along version. That is something that we could sentence middle-aged men to. It would be like their kryptonite. But he is he's their driver, and then they ask him to unblock his toilet on the tour bus, and he goes, you know what he's going to say, don't you? I would do anything for these girls, but I won't do that. and and I think we may have just got to the bottom of the mystery here, which may have been that Meat Loaf didn't get offered very much and just said yes to anything. Meat Loaf's agent may have just been too open.
He also claimed, there's an obituary of him, I think in Entertainment Weekly, after he died, that said one of the things that people don't know about Meat Loaf is actually he helped edit Fight Club. So he was on set the whole time. And according to Meat Loaf, Bryan Singer started turning to him saying, which scene should we use? Which scene should we use? And there is a Meat Loaf sensibility in this movie. It's also really interesting about how it's coded. So to go back to what you said earlier, it doesn't come across as in obvious ways right. And I was thinking as you were talking, in a late 1990s context, one way you could code this is Timothy McVeigh or Unabomber. So Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, or the Unabomber.
So the Unabomber, I remember I went to the museum in Washington and saw his cabin. He was a kind of anti-technological progress guy. Is that right? He wrote almost sort of Dominic Cummings length manifestos, didn't he? He wrote an extremely long manifesto.
He did, and he killed people. I mean, so he was genuinely a terrorist. But he was also a kind of math genius and a professor. He leant left.
What were Timothy McVeigh's politics then?
Kind of conspiracy theory nut job, I think.
It's interesting because also this is the same time. I mean, I think we can probably say that he had some bad politics given his actions, but this was also the time of the X-Files of the late 90s or the early 90s through to the late 90s, which was the source of lots of anti-government conspiracies in a way that at the time was not obviously coded left or right. That's still the case now, is you still have kind of crunchy left anti-vaxism, and you also have right-wing, I don't trust the government, to put the chip things in me kind of anti-vax sentiment. So conspiracy theory was distributed across the political spectrum. But the point also about the X-Files was that the conspiracy theory was always right. There always was a chupacabra. And I think that there's a similar, not exactly lazy, but reflexive anti-government sentiment in this. But the feeling is I don't know whether it's different in Chuck Palahniuk's original book. I just never quite believe the political cause or that anyone really cares about the political cause. And in the original book, I'm informed by my husband, the thing they blow up is a museum. You're like, what's the National Portrait Gallery done to you, Chuck Palahniuk? So in that case, I think it makes it even more a move that actually this is really about nihilism. and the sort of pursuit of self-destruction or the pursuit of sensation and feeling. And the political stuff is just very much the sprinkles on top that justifies you doing things you wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it did not come across at all like a conspiracy theory film. It doesn't have that vibe to it. These people are just doing this stuff for kicks. There's something that they believe in, but they're not spending a lot of time working out what that thing is. When you look at the violence, the fighting, and the ways in which they try and explain why it's so important for men like them to punch each other in the face. And it is an exceptionally violent film. I mean, that's the other thing to say about it. When you're used to kind of CGI violence, the violence is fake. Obviously, I assume they're not breaking each other's faces, but it's extremely bloody and it's bone crunching and it's squalid. It's not glamorous. It's dirty. It's kind of filthy. They're doing it in filthy settings. But it's also about young men, and some of them are middle-aged by the time, Fight Club grows and everyone wants to be a part of it. But it's about men getting in touch with that part of themselves that has been suppressed or repressed by the culture they live in. And I was thinking, you can draw a line from that to now, but does it go to Andrew Tate? Does it go to Jordan Peterson? Does it go to Joe Rogan? There are lots, and those are not the same thing. That's not the same line. I found a clip online of Jordan Peterson talking about Fight Club, in which he simultaneously says it's a fascist movie, and I really like it, he says. And he says that what he likes about it is it teaches this absolutely central lesson, which is the first thing that men have to do is they have to get in touch with the capacity for violence in themselves. They have to recognize it. They mustn't deny it. And then having brought it to the surface, they have to learn to control it. And that's what this film is teaching us. I don't think this film is teaching us that, but that is a direct line. I mean, if Jordan Peterson thinks Fight Club is teaching that message, this is an early version of Jordan Peterson's philosophy.
Stop if I've told you this before, but when I was doing my research for my big Jordan Peterson interview back in 2018, I read his first book, Maps of Meaning, which starts off with this absolutely incredible scene where he goes to a maximum security prison when he's a young psychologist to study the psychology of murderers. And by his own account, he's wearing knee-high leather boots and a cape, which is not what I would choose to personally to wear to a maximum security prison, but each to their own. And he's introduced to all these murderers. And there's one little guy who doesn't look prepossessing, and he made two policemen dig their own graves before shooting them and burying them in them. And then there's also a guy who's got this massive axe scar. And there's a line in it which has stuck with me because it's like the wound was something like the wound was so big that it would have killed a lesser man, a man like me. And you're like, oh, it's a little bit on the nose there, isn't it? And I think that what the violence in this speaks to is a sort of sense of inadequacy. And this came up in my interview with him about the kind of whether or not you feel the attraction of these kind of violent ideologies, and then you have to kind of master that within yourself. And I think there is this precisely the violence is attractive to people who deep down don't think that they could do it. And I think that might be the case with Jordan Peterson, who seems to be, in his personal life, a perfectly, one of the things he seems to most genuinely enjoy is spending time with his grandkids and family. Like he's not wandering around decking people. He bursts into tears an awful lot. Like he's very in touch with his emotions. Whereas Andrew Tate, when the Vice filmmakers went to do their first documentary about him, I was talking to Matt, who was one of them, who was saying that the bit where Andrew Tate really warmed to him was when they did have a cage fighting match in Romania at this meetup of all Andrew Tate and all his fans. And Matt O'Shea volunteered to get in the ring with one of these professional fighters. And the idea was that everybody had to get in the ring with the professional fighters who would obviously beat them and hurt them quite badly. And that was the bit that proved you were a man. And Matt did that, and that's why Andrew Tate really kind of let him continue filming. And then after that, there was a bit when they lined up all the people who'd taken their beating and essentially hailed them as men, like they had been through this kind of this ritual. And there's pretty good psychological and anthropological research about what they call dysphoric rituals. So rituals that cause you pain. These are really good for bonding people together. It's why lots of societies have had manhood rituals that are physically painful, because the idea is that you go through them and then you have been through something and that proves that you're a man. But yeah, the thing that sort of fascinates me about Andrew Tate, clearly obviously very much into mixed martial arts, also campus knickers. Genuinely one of the campus figures. And this is why I think it probably only appeals to younger teenagers, because I think by the age of 18, you think the dressing gowns and the, oh, I'm so hard, mate, and that sort of strange glottal stoppy voice of his just actually begin to seem kind of intensely comic. And then he obviously does these tweets that are sort of basically like, there's nothing gayer than sleeping with women. And you think, what are we doing here? So I think there's obviously like a longing for this to mean something. And then this is what makes you real as a person for lots of people who don't feel real. And I wonder if that's why it also appeals to people now, because I think that's the feeling lots of people describe about spending too much time online or too much time looking at their phone, is that they don't feel like a body anymore. They feel like this sort of brain that's floating around. They don't feel solid. They feel insubstantial. And one thing that I imagine makes you feel very substantial is getting hit in the face, really having that encounter with having a physical body.
Do you think it is a fascist film? So we were saying it doesn't really code right. So Jordan Peterson thinks it's a fascist film. And interestingly, the film he compares it to is Iron Man. He says Iron Man is also a fascist film. Now, Iron Man, that character is based on Elon Musk. And there is in Fight Club, I mean, one of the things that struck me as feeling quite now is when they start to talk about Tyler Durden, the Brad Pitt version of Tyler Durden, as this sort of mythic leader of this movement, which is what they've become. And it's true, he's training them up and they're being made to stand outside for 3 days without food in the rain, and they got to prove their toughness. So it's got, it's a bit fascistic in that way. But when Edward Norton goes around the country and hears these rumors about Tyler Durden, it's him, but he doesn't realize it. He thinks it's Brad Pitt. He's a legend. He only sleeps an hour a night. He's like a tech CEO. It's the way that people talk about Elon Musk and others. They don't sleep. They're always on it. They have this amazing capacity. They can be in more, Edward Norton doesn't understand how is Tyler Durden in all these different places at the same time, in the same way people look at Elon Musk, and you sometimes feel that too. So it feels a bit like it's an early version of what we're now used to, which is the eulogizing of.
It's the grind set. That's what you've got to have. You've just got to be a grindfluencer. And yeah, I agree with you. I finally finished my book on genius, and one of the final chapters is about Elon Musk. And the working title for it all the way through was Extremely Hardcore, which is what he said when he took over Twitter. He sent out an email to everybody saying, some of you aren't going to make it. It was a bit like a kind of the Fight Club recruitment thing. It's like, a lot of you aren't going to make it through this process.
You're going to want to eat, and I'm not going to let you.
Right, exactly. Some of you will want to go home and sleep in your own beds, and that's not what we do around here. But I want you to be extremely hardcore. I'm only interested in that. And I just think it's such a fascinating thing, because obviously the rewards to Elon Musk of being extremely hardcore are enormous. He's now one of the most influential people in the United States, and he's one of the richest men in the world, if not now currently, I think, the richest. But if you're his engineer, when you miss seeing the birth of your first child so that you can grind out a bit of code at 2 a.m. for Elon Musk, is Elon Musk going to care about you 6 months later? No, he's not. You're going to get fired summarily. I mean, Fight Club is a cult, and lots of those tech companies operate essentially as cults. I think when you read about, the way that they want to keep everybody there, and they have these founders, the way that Elizabeth Holmes ran Theranos, the blood testing company that turned out to just, the machine didn't work. She'd essentially managed to create a kind of cult around herself about this is what a young female entrepreneur looks like. We're going to revolutionize medicine. And you sell the visionary so hard that people get a sort of version of Stockholm syndrome, where they think, you've given me this incredible vision, you're asking me to work so hard, that is proof that the mission is worth it. And if I just subsume myself to this goal, I will find sort of salvation and freeness in the collective. And it's just a kind of great irony that's happening in Silicon Valley, a place that is supposedly full of, rugged libertines, but actually what some people want. And if you read Character Limit, which is the book about Elon Musk take over Twitter, some of these people were sort of cheerfully, there's an executive in there, a female executive, who cheerfully posts a photo of herself with a sleeping bag in the office. And guess what? Gets pushed out about 6 months later. But that some people wanted to kind of make a big play of their sort of self-abasement in the face of this great man. And it was very much like the first rule of X is that you do not question Elon Musk. The second rule of X is that you do not question Elon Musk. And so I can totally see the trajectory of that as well, having followed through. I bet Elon Musk loves this film in a way in which he thinks that Tyler Durden is a straightforward hero, despite the fact that Tyler Durden, objectively in the universe of this film, one of the people that he would hate is Elon Musk.
I think you're right. I think you're right. How are we meant to understand the ending? What are we meant to think it means? I'm not sure I know. So he realizes that these are two sides of the same person. He is Tyler Durden. And in order to liberate himself from Tyler Durden, he shoots himself in the head, thereby killing the Brad Pitt part of his persona and liberating himself, though he seems to be disfigured, though it's not clear whether he really is disfigured or not. He then makes a connection, a real connection for the first time with the character played by Helena Bonham Carter, and he says to her in a line that is quite funny, but is also quite weird.
I met you at a very strange time in my life. And then the buildings fall and the Pixies' Where Is My Mind, which has got that kind of eerie wailing in it, starts up. It's a great ending to a film.
It looks amazing. And the buildings fall one by one. Unless there are a lot of credit card companies, they can't all have been the credit card headquarters.
I did say that because I was in that kind of like annoying nitpicking phase by this point. I was like, isn't it strange that all the companies have ended up building their headquarters in the same place in the city?
So basically all of the corporate buildings come down. It looks gorgeous. It's got a kind of Apocalypse Now feel to it. There's nothing more beautiful than big explosions. Yeah. What does it mean?
Yeah, like a firework display. Something that Stephen Kears pointed out in his essay, which is that there is nowhere any attempt to place this. It is supposed to be happening in a kind of nowhere, in that all the zip codes are fake. You would never, it's just called the police department, the fire department. There is no attempt to say this is New York or this is LA or this is, small town, this is Scranton, Pennsylvania, or whatever it might be. And that kind of gives it like it is supposed to therefore be a universal message at the end, right? He's struck a blow against capitalism universally rather than any specifically inflected version of it. I think that's how it's supposed to mean. But you're right, it's very weird that he sort of shoots himself. What you think is he's trying to kill himself, but he doesn't. And then he actually seems to be able to speak after shooting himself in the face, which is impressive as a party trick. But also the part of my brain, the sort of sad cynic part, is going, I mean, they're going to arrest him. He might be like, oh, I've laid Tyler Durden to rest, but he did those crimes and he's probably on CCTV somewhere. And that's what I mean about the kind of lack of thoughtfulness in the politics, is that it actually just goes sheer spectacle and your brain is bowled over by that and you love it and the song is great. And then the credits roll and you walk out thinking, yes, modern life is full of anime. And you don't really think none of this actually made any sense whatsoever.
And there is an alternative ending if people want to watch the Chinese version. So it was edited in China so that at the end, rather than the buildings blow up, words come up on the screen that say he was arrested, the police infiltrated the plot and brought down all of the criminals. He was taken away to a mental asylum and he was released in 2012. That's the Chinese ending of the film.
One of the things that I think is nice and does embroider the kind of fascistic idea about it is that when the narrator goes in to report the plot and try and stop it by going to the police, only the senior police guy, who I think is black actually, takes him seriously and he leaves the room. And then the three remaining police officers who are white are all actually also members of Project Mayhem. And I think that's the kind of thing that makes people feel that it is fascist, because although these are supposed to be anti-establishment people, it's actually ended up attracting people from the establishment who just like kicking the shit out of each other. And therefore it's attracted police officers. But I think that Chinese end, I almost want to watch the Chinese ending more. And then the book ending apparently has him waking up in what he thinks is heaven, but is actually a mental hospital. And even the people guarding him there are also members of Project Mayhem. So there's a sort of sense that Project Mayhem is now universal.
The other movie it reminded me of a little bit was The Truman Show, because I do like the way in this film, and it's probably the creepiest aspect of it, when he's really struggling to make sense of what's happened to him and he's starting to suspect that this is all a projection of himself. One of the symptoms of this is that the members of Project Mayhem are everywhere. So he goes to the police station, he's in places where he thinks he's going to find people who are outside of the project, and he gets the nod and the wink. He's sitting in a bar, he's being served in a diner, and the people who are serving him call him sir and just give him that little nod. And there's suddenly that feeling the whole thing is fake in that sense, that the world he's inhabited is simply all of it projecting back on him. And that does have a Truman Show vibe. The Truman Show, which is one of the films of this era which is dated best, I should say, I think.
I would say that is late 90s as well. That's really interesting, because I wondered to me whether or not, are these all reflections of the birth of the internet? I mean, I first got the internet at home in 1996 or so. Suddenly that's when it kind of, and I suspect America being richer was a little bit ahead of Worcester in the 1990s in terms of the number of families who had a computer at home. So is that whole spate of films, and I think you'd say this about The Matrix and also about American Psycho, because American Psycho, one of the premises is you don't know whether or not any of it's happened and whether Patrick Bateman is actually Patrick Bateman or he's this other guy and this is all just a complete fantasy. But all of those films, and this one too, is essentially saying my life doesn't feel real. And I don't know whether or not that's because they all come out of the early internet era, or is that something that humans have always thought? Because I can't think of a film before that era in which the central premise is my life feels alienated to me. There's a quote I think about a lot from Susan Sontag's On Photography, which is the 1970s. And she says, photography has become a way of refusing experience. Now you just see it all over the internet, right? People filming disasters and tornadoes as if that means magically that the effects of the tornado will never catch up with you. And the phrase being, the cameraman never dies, because people just sort of assume that if you're filming something, it's not really happening to you. And so that obviously that had started to happen with the rise of the personal camera in the 70s. But yeah, I wonder if the best way to think about Fight Club is as part of an internet era trend of people suddenly feeling alienated from their bodies as much as anything else.
It's really interesting. So now I think about it, I don't know when I got the internet, but I still feel it was only sometime in this century when I started to think of the internet as something that was watching me rather than as something that was a tool that either did or didn't work for communication. And to me, the late 90s, I may be getting the history garbled here, but it's the reality TV era. These are TV-based sensibilities, I feel, but a sense of, in the 90s, so TV had become ubiquitous in the States from, the 60s on. But in the 90s, that feeling that everyone was on TV, that to me is a 90s thing. I think it's a 90s thing. Maybe I'm pushing it back, but sort of real life on MTV, that kind of thing, that's 90s, isn't it? Late 90s?
The first Big Brother was 2000, so it predates that, but there probably were things that were reality TV adjacent. But I guess it's also the same thing of screens. I guess that's what we're really talking about. And the idea that you see people on screens who are living lives that just happen entirely inside the screen. Because there's a whole bit in The Matrix when they go into the real world and actually one of the people, I think it's Cypher, decides he hates the real world because it's crap and you can only eat gruel. And he wants to go back into the Matrix where he can eat steak. And he says, I know this is fake and it's just the computer telling my brain it is, but this tastes great to me. And he wanted to be fooled. And I guess it's irrelevant to some extent whether or not that's the TV or the internet. It's definitely digital technology, in some case screen technology, that was making people feel that they were having this set of emotions that were completely divorced from their bodies. I don't really feel until the creation of the iPhone, which is like 2008, that I really felt oppressed by the internet, in the sense my initial reaction to the iPhone was, this is amazing, I'm never going to be bored again. And then it didn't take very long for me to be like, why do I feel twitchy when this is more than a foot away from me? That I've got a kind of external limb that if I don't know where it is at times, I feel panicked.
And even with Google, which did originate in the late 90s, it took a while, certainly for me, to think of it as something that was using me rather than I was using it. I'm now completely aware of the ways in which we are the product when we use Google. But early on, it just seemed like, before it was inshittified, it seemed like just a useful tool.
Oh, when this film came out, I would have been using Ask Jeeves. That's that's where we were back in 1999.
And were you feeling oppressed? Were you feeling oppressed and surveilled?
I was not feeling oppressed by Ask Jeeves or by ICQ Messenger. But yeah, I mean, this would have been around the time that I started seriously to spend a lot of time talking to people online, people whose identities you didn't really know. I was part of a really early social network called BME Zine in the late 1990s. So that, even if it wasn't necessarily exactly the internet per se, I think definitely the longing for real life and then for real masculinity being part of that seems very apt for this era.
And just on the third of those three names that I mentioned, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan is the one, it's probably a bit of a stretch to draw a line from this movie to him. Of those three, he is by far the most influential now and the most significant figure in American cultural and political life. And yet, as I was watching this film, I probably haven't listened to enough Joe Rogan to know if it's right, but he kept coming to mind. Maybe that's a mistake. I'm not sure. Maybe that actually he's outside of this. It's a different kind of sensibility.
I think where the overlap is that Joe Rogan has always been a conspiracy theorist, and he will say this himself, that he's always been really interested in UFOs, for example. So he has always been anti-establishment. And that was, when he was in a Hollywood liberal, like when he lived in LA and all his friends were Democrats, that kind of expressed itself as a kind of left-wing conspiracism. And he was very interested in Bernie Sanders circa 2016, 2018 as a kind of outsider to the Democrats. And then the course of his politics over the course of the Biden term and then in this last election has been towards Trump, and who he ended up endorsing. And this is what I mean about whether or not Fight Club is right or left-wing coded. I don't think at the time it was obviously right-wing coded. It's just that energy, that anti-establishment energy, it could come out as Just Stop Oil. It could come out in left-wing ways. But the one that we're most used to hearing about is it coming out in MAGA. What was that Nick Fuentes thing that after that, your body, my choice, these kind of very outrageous explorations of sort of masculine dominance. But Joe Rogan is, I think, slightly different to the others because he's not a sort of self-styled intellectual. He's not got a kind of, he's just a guy who likes to smoke weed, do martial arts and chat to his comedian buddies and then occasionally get smart people on. There's a brilliant 4chan meme which he himself posted about the fact that he's like some barbarian Khan who summons wise men to him and says, you explain to Joe why sky rise in morning. And they do. And then Tiny Hat Man explained why sky rise in morning. And so he's just got this open-mindedness, which isn't where these young guys in this they are. They're not. If anything, their problem is too fixed thinking. They've just taken against the world and taken against their mothers, and they've decided everything needs to blow up. They're probably more like another great 90s film, The Nihilists from The Big Lebowski. than they are like Joe Rogan.
Yeah, well, that is quite a connection. And Joe Rogan is not, he's not, I don't think, a celebrator of pain as such.
But he's a mixed martial arts commentator, and that's what he was before he was a podcast host. He went from being in a sitcom about offices, actually, so another tie-in with Fight Club, to being a mixed martial arts commentator. So he definitely likes men beating each other up.
But in Fight Club, the feeling is that the whole, as you said, the whole point of this in the end actually is suffering. I mean, it's about a kind of bonding through suffering. This is not competition. So in Fight Club, it absolutely does not matter who wins. And the fights that we see, they end with someone in the end concedes, but they often crowd around the loser and celebrate the loser. The more blood you have, the more bits that are hanging off you, the more gaping wounds you have, that's what makes you the winner. And that does feel a bit more like that Jordan Peterson version that we were talking about than Joe Rogan.
There's a very good review of one of the most sympathetic reviews of Jordan Peterson's thought is by the rationalist blogger Scott Alexander, who blogs the Slate Star Codex now, Astral Codex 10, in which he said that the writer that Peterson most reminded him was C.S. Lewis, because it's all about suffering. And that's what you see all the way through Peterson's work, is this idea of suffering and therefore, kind of absolution through it. And that is exactly what Fight Club is about, right? The idea that you kind of come to this higher state of purity through suffering. Andrew Tate, I would say, has adopted this. He's the bad version. He's adopted the aesthetic of Fight Club, right? Which is abs and saying sort of slightly misogynistic things and just hanging out with your bros in your Lamborghini. And then Jordan Peterson encapsulates the suffering bit. So, these are tropes that still obviously speak to a lot of people, a lot of young men in particular.
Final question. It's in a series that we're calling Great Political Films. Are we going to say it's a great movie? I mean, as we talk about it, it's incredibly interesting. And actually, the more I've been listening to you talk about it, the more I feel there's more in this film than there is in almost any other film of this era. I think it's a much more interesting film than The Matrix, for instance.
Yeah, I think that The Matrix looks beautiful, and bullet time was a really brilliant innovation in filmmaking. But the trench coats did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of making it seem like it was, and there was a whole bit where people tried to sort of say, well, actually, it's about Cartesian dualism. And you were like, And actually, one of the things that the Wachowskis, who have now both transitioned to being women, have said is that it's about gender, it's about feeling trapped in your body. So there are interesting things to say about The Matrix. And I think really interesting things to say about American Psycho, the film of which was written and directed by women, which is very unusual for the late 1990s. So I think all of these films bear rewatching. And there's a lots of little, I think sometimes with great pieces of art, they feel like every bit of them sort of makes sense and works. But actually also there are little bits that you sometimes stub a toe on that don't quite fit in, that later when you think about them are more interesting than they appear on the surface. And that's what I mean about things like, the guy in the testicular cancer support group is actually a worse filmmaker than David Fincher could not have introduced that tonal note into the rest of Fight Club. And the performances are great too, right? Brad Pitt doesn't have a lot to work with Tyler Durden. And Edward Norton, again, the whole performance of that character is to be so unbelievably low key that you're almost not there. You're not there in your own life, which is not a thing that gives an actor a great deal to work with, just being very tired. And Helena Bonham Carter, similarly, there's one bit when her English accent comes out, but apart from that, she's stellar throughout. And again, a role that's basically about smoking and having bird's nest hair. They do a lot of great work, the actors.
The other thing I'd say that saves Fight Club and did not save The Matrix is a film that we know would have been bad is Fight Club 2. And there is no Fight Club 2, Fight Club Revolutions.
Is there no Fight Club 2? Oh, no, there's an American Psycho 2, which is a film I'm confident in saying I think is bad.
I'm pretty sure, I mean, if there is a Fight Club 2, then all of my theories don't stand up. But I'm pretty sure, I mean, one of the problems with The Matrix is it just gets worse and worse through each iteration. And I can't think of any way in which Fight Club 2 would be a good movie. Not any way. I can't think of any version of it which would work. And I'm pretty confident that there isn't one. There's the Chinese version. That's a different thing. That's not Fight Club 2. That's Chinese censored Fight Club.
No, you're right. It's a film with an ending, which I think particularly because we've lived through the MCU era, we've lived through these giant canons that are essentially supposed to be like Norse mythology, where it's all like a giant embroidery. One thing watching it did make me nostalgic for the era in which you could make a weird mid-budget film. And we really don't get very many of those now. You get very low budget films, or you get massive studio ones that have to be based on existing IP, or they have to be superhero films. And if you look at that period of richness that we've been talking about all the way through, it was a great time for political cinema. People tried to make movies that said something or explored something in a way that is much harder to do now.
A lot of you were up bright and early on Boxing Day, and some of you did point out to us then that there was a mistake in the last episode. It is, of course, Public Enemy and not NWA who recorded Fight the Power, Thank you to everyone who reminded us of that, and to everyone over the past year who has reminded us of some of the mistakes that we've made. We do try really hard not to make them, which is not the same as avoiding them altogether. This is the last podcast of ours of 2024. Thank you to all of you for listening. It's been a huge amount of fun for us making this podcast, and we are really excited about what we've got coming up in 2025. New series and lots of new ideas. But before that, there are just a few more films to get through in this series. Next time, it's going to be what I think is probably the greatest film of the 21st century. Paul Thomas Anderson's completely remarkable There Will Be Blood, starring the completely remarkable Daniel Day-Lewis. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.